Webb McKinney began his career at HP when David Packard and Bill Hewlett ran the company, holding numerous engineering management and executive positions. Webb led HP's entry into consumer PCs and eventually ran the entire PC business. Before retiring from HP in 2003, Webb was the executive vice president responsible for HP's integration of Compaq, one of the largest tech mergers of all time. Webb is currently a consultant in merger integration and leadership development and serves on 3 nonprofit boards. Philip Meza is a strategy consultant and researcher focused on technology strategy and business development. Much of his research into strategy has been done at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, where he worked with Andy Grove and Robert Bergelman. The 3 of them co-authored a book on technology strategy titled Strategic Dynamics, Concepts and Cases, and Philip is also the author of Coming Attractions, Hollywood, High Tech, and the Future of Entertainment. Won't you join me in welcoming Webb and Philip to our stage?
Thank you, David.
Thanks.
Thank you, David.
Thanks. Well, the title of your book is no accident, Becoming Hewlett-Packard. It's a study of the transformations of the enterprise that Bill and Dave started some 77 years ago through the lens of major strategic decisions and dilemmas facing each of the firm's CEOs. So I thought it might make sense to begin to compare and contrast where the firm began and where it's come today. So Philip, could you briefly describe the first 5 years of the company, and then maybe Webb could talk about the most recent 5 years for the enterprise?
Sure. Thank you, David, and thank you all for coming out. Appreciate it. When you think of the first 5 years of Hewlett-Packard, what stands out to me is the fact that so many of the hallmarks that characterized and were responsible for the success of the company for decades to come were really established in those first years. So Hewlett-Packard, as probably everybody here knows, was founded by Bill Hewlett and Dave Packard. They were in their mid-20s, graduates of Stanford, and they were brought together by their engineering professor, Fred Terman, who was really the godfather of the Valley. And from our perspective, Hewlett-Packard is really the original garage startup. It's the company of Silicon Valley, and that's because they were really the germ that started this valley. And when you think of the hallmarks that developed so the company was founded in 1939, in January 1939. And a story that Terman likes to tell is they were doing pretty well right off the bat, right? As soon as they founded, they had some business. And they operated out of Dave Packard's garage, famously, which is a landmark now. And Terman said when he would drive by, if Packard's car was in the driveway, he knew HP was doing okay because Bill and Dave were in the garage making product. So a few months after they started, Dave thinks it's a good idea to get a loan, a line of credit from a bank. And a banker says, most businesses die from indigestion than starvation. And Dave takes that back to Bill, and they really take that to heart. And that's where they learn to really be careful about growth and to manage their growth wisely, not to grow too quickly. Well, soon after, this is 1939, so within a couple of years, the United States enters World War II, which really increases demand for their products. And Hewlett-Packard are very careful to grow how they grow because they remember this advice. And so they're careful about not growing willy-nilly and being careful to stick to their knitting, and they pretty much stuck to devices that were very similar to what you see there, which is the younger brother of their first product that they sold to Disney famously. And were successful. They grew from $100,000 in 1941 to $2 million by the end of the war. So they're kind of the unicorn startup of their time. The next hallmark is a bit more personal, and I think that's the partnership that developed between Bill and Dave. Bill Hewlett joined the Army soon after the United States entered World War II, and he left Dave to run the company by himself, demonstrated the kind of trust that the two had in each other. And indeed, decades later, in the late 60s, that would be reversed when Packard left the company to join the Department of Defense. And so that kind of trust is the second hallmark that I think developed. And a third hallmark is really the way that Bill and Dave thought about their employees. Bill and Dave made sure that their employees were able to, during World War II, were able to do what was essentially profit sharing, bonuses on production. And that sounds simple, but it was very hard to do because of wage and price controls that were in effect at that time to control inflation. But Dave insisted on it and was able to get it passed. And so that shows that the fact that they really took care and wanted to share in the success of the company with their employees. And the fourth hallmark is really, I think, investing for the future. At the end of World War II, the demand for their products really came to a screeching halt because the war ended and the war-related demand ended. And so Dave and Bill, who was joined the company at that time, had to take the company from 200 employees to 80. So they had to do those kinds of massive layoffs, which was a big deal for them. And they remembered this to the rest of their lives because each of them hired these people, and they had to lay them off. But something that's interesting is that when he was in the service, Bill Hewlett met a lot of talented engineers. And even while they were doing these layoffs, Bill and Dave hired a lot of the most talented engineers that Hewlett had ran into, even though they had no work for them at the time, because they were investing in their future. And I think, so right at within the first 5 years of their founding, you see these hallmarks that were to stay with the company for decades and be largely responsible for their success.
So we end the first 5 years with 80 employees.
Yeah.
Where are we today?
Well, so the last 5 years have been pretty active for Hewlett-Packard. So in 2011, Meg Whitman became HP's 8th CEO over the 70-plus year history, the 4th consecutive outside CEO in the past 12 years. So there's been a lot of turnover. HP's revenue peaked in 2011 at $127 billion. I think that was more than your period, right?
A little bit.
Just checking.
A little bit.
Yeah. I don't even know. Someone here may know hundreds of thousands of people at that point in time. But, you know, the revenue also declined during the last 5 years. So I think it declined from the $127 billion to about $103 billion in 2015. Earnings also declined, and in order to try to manage profit, HP was sort of continuously laying off people. So this value that Hewlett and Packard committed themselves to in the early going to try to avoid layoffs was possible for a long time, but the last 5 years that was not the story. R&D, which was also always the hallmark of HP in the early days, by investing in those engineers, had declined quite a bit in the years prior to this. But I think when Whitman started, it was under 3% of sales, which compares to what used to be 8 to 10%, used to be the bogey in the old days. But Whitman was able to grow that to 3.4% in spite of reducing expenses overall. So that's consistent, I think, with what Hewlett and Packard were doing in their time. One thing that's interesting is at the end of 2015, there were 4 independent publicly traded companies that used to be Hewlett-Packard. So there was Agilent, which was spun off in '99, about $4 billion at the end of 2015. Keysight, which is the original test and measurement business, has now been spun off twice, was spun off from Agilent. Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, Keysight's about $2.9 billion in revenue. These are 2015 numbers. HP Enterprise at about $50 billion in 2015, and HP Inc., which is PCs and printers, at $48 billion. So there are 4 companies and countless other parts of companies that used to be part of HP from selling off, because it's interesting that when Agilent spun off from HP, one of the first things they did is sell off a bunch of their businesses. So they got smaller before they got bigger. They sold LED lighting and medical to Philips and so on. And HP Enterprise has done something quite similar. They basically, pretty soon after they separated from HP, they sold off their services and software business. So they're trying, it's interesting, once they've separated from the mothership, it seems more attractive to get smaller and more focused. I would say culturally, I haven't been with the company in some time, but I think versions of the HP way are probably still pretty strong in Agilent and Keysight and even in HP Inc. And HP Enterprise has been a result of so many mergers. I don't know what the culture is like there. Interestingly, HP, I've talked now about the two HPs, are still really leaders in their field. Hewlett-Packard Enterprise is #1 in servers. Hewlett-Packard HP Inc., #1 in printing, #1 or 2, depending on the year against Lenovo and PCs. So they're still leading in their product areas, but growth has been challenging for them because their markets are not growing. Both HP overall and both parts now of what was HP have been shrinking in the last 5 years. And I guess I'll just close by saying that's obviously not what a company wants to see happen, and yet HP's not alone of the large tech companies in struggling with growth. I think IBM's growth rates have also been negative in that 5-year period. Cisco, Intel, and Microsoft are growing at low to mid single digits. And the big companies that have been able to keep growing, interesting enough, are Amazon, Alphabet, and Apple. So there are, HP, and we'll talk about this more, HP, when it hit sort of 40+ billion in the 90s, started worrying about how it was going to keep growing. It had gotten so big. And in fact, most companies do struggle around that point or thereabouts. But there are some notable exceptions out there, and it's interesting to understand how they've been able to continue to grow at such a big size. So that's the last 5 years.
Well, that's just a tremendous change in sort of scale and scope, if you think about it. One company to 4+ companies, headcount, revenue, a tremendous fields of interest. And I do think that there are some echoes of that, the nature of that change in the earliest period of the company when Hewlett and Packard ran their namesake.
Right.
In particular, the book marks out 1957 as a pivotal year, critical moment for the firm, both for structure and culture. And Philip, I was wondering if you could take us into 1957.
Right. Well, so after World War II, the company struggles a bit with demand, but they stick to the knitting and they begin to grow again. And they're very much a very successful partnership throughout the 40s and into the 50s. But growth but they started growing actually pretty well, and business was very good. And so by the time we get to 1957, they've been in business for about 18 years, and they're thinking, well, we need to IPO this. So they've been in business 18 years, profitable for 18 years, IPO then, not 18 minutes and then IPO. 18 years and they IPO. But by this time, they're no longer a partnership. They're really a big company, a biggish company in every respect. So they have systems involved. They have systems established for their structure. So they've developed a division model, which is giving a lot of autonomy to the individual divisions of the company. Now, Bill and Dave ran that show, and they set the strategy. But they told their division heads where to go, and it was up to the division heads to get there. So they gave them a lot of autonomy. So the division model is set. And it's funny, we right up from the people we talked to in the 50s, right up into the 80s and 90s, the job everybody aspired to at HP was to be a division head. You didn't want to go work in headquarters and pal around with the CEO and the president. You wanted to be out running your division. So that was established by 1957. The fields of interest had been established. They make a couple of key acquisitions about that time. They do F.L. Mosley, which in many respects was the antecedent to their printer group, which Webb's going to talk about later, which prints money and saves the company in the 80s and 90s, and Sanborn, which is the antecedent to the medical business, which is also very helpful for them, acquired by this time. And so in 1957, they IPO. And in their first letter to investors, Dave, it was Dave who wrote this, writes, our philosophy is simple: leadership in our field by making a contribution. Not me too, we're making a real contribution. And soon after the IPO, the top management, I think it was the top 40 or so, it was a pretty widely spread out group, go off to Sonoma and they go to think about what the company wants to be. And they come up with this, which is essentially the HP way, which is really a codification of the way they had been doing business all along. And they boil it down, in 1957, the HP way, they could boil it down to 5 tenets, which was technical contribution, making a meaningful contribution to having a product that makes a meaningful contribution, was one. Profitable growth, which was another, which we saw indigestion and not starvation. Trust people. Now that's verbatim. Trust people. This is in the days where people had locked supply cabinets and locked, and you really kept a close eye on people. No, Bill and Dave, no, they hired, they took care in who they hired, and then they trusted them. And contribute to community was another one. And you said that sounds like it's just kind of a nicety, but it means something when you think that Dave Packard was on the school board in Palo Alto. You know, he had better things to do than go to school board meetings. He was on the school board. Bill Hewlett, similarly involved in his community, and they really expected people to be involved in their communities in which HP did business. And the fifth one was integrity. And you see this from we interviewed 80 people, and many of them were HP, and many were HP long lifers. And the integrity that you see is really palpable. And so that was the codification of the HP way. And stock bonuses. So employee stock ownership. In 1957, employees were given stock. And in 1959, there's this lovely letter that we got from the files of I think it was Court.
Yeah.
A long time, he passed away a year and a half ago, a wonderful fellow, kept a room in his house full of his files and made them available to us. And I pull out this letter, and it's from Dave Packard, and it says, "Dear gang," and it's to everybody at HP in 1959. It said, we're establishing this stock ownership program. Talk it over with your family and see if you'd like to decide whether or not you'd like to invest. And when you think about how many times, I think the shares split 15 times since then. When you think about, if your family said, yeah, let's go ahead and invest, you would have done pretty well. But again, so that we see that harkening back to the 40s. You remember with the bonuses, you see sharing of the profits very important. Sharing of the success of the company with employees is very important, and all established in 1957.
Yeah, could I add a couple of
Please.
things? Yeah, one thing I think that's maybe 2 points out of this HP Way document that I think are noteworthy, particularly as we think about how the company evolved and some of the decisions that were made. First was that Packard felt very strongly that profit was really important, but it was the result of building great products. So he said that profit's the best measure of your contribution. And so, many companies think about profit as an end in itself, but to Dave and Bill, it was the result of doing a great job of your customers paying you so much more than it cost you to make that product because it met their needs so well. So, and I don't know how many of you read the Isaacson book about Steve Jobs, but Jobs uses that exact same quote when he comes back to Apple and transforms Apple the second time he was there, that they'd gotten focused on, the finance people had taken over, and the profit was from cost cutting, not from great products. And the second point is about growth. And growth was important, but it was never an end in itself in Bill and Dave's mind. Growth, profitable growth was important. They never wanted you to buy market share. If you ever wanted to see those guys angry, you'd say, oh, we're going to lose money on this one for a while so we can gain market share. That would probably be your last conversation with Packard for sure, and maybe with both of them. So there was this very strong belief, and HP grew at about a 15% per year rate, certainly over the first many decades. It wasn't doubling every year. It was growing at a pretty measured pace, and it was because of this philosophy that growth wasn't an end in itself. What was important was making a contribution and financing your own growth so you can maintain control of your destiny.
And you guys who came today are lucky because those are two examples of contribution right there, the oscillator and the printer.
I wanted to ask just a quick kind of follow-on, which is there's a wonderful section in your book talking to Tom Perkins, who started at Hewlett-Packard and then went on to become a renowned venture investor, where he says that Bill and Dave ran the company in many ways like a venture capital and investment firm. So much so that he says whatever he learned and accomplished in venture investing came from learning from them. Was that evident? First of all, what do you think of that claim? And do you think that was evident in this 1957 period already?
I'll start and then maybe.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So yes, I believe that claim. I believe that claim because, and I believe it was probably evident by 1957 because you think of the businesses that they choose to acquire and how they acquired them. So when they acquired Mosley, it was kind of like Warren Buffett acquiring you. You know, the people stayed, and they wanted to be acquired by Hewlett Packard, and they were able to make use of that asset and develop that asset, much the way that a venture capitalist tries to improve the altogether more nascent company that they acquire, but much in the same way. And what the other aspect of what Perkins was getting at was that Bill and Dave gave you scope to run. They set the strategy, but they let you decide how you want to do it. And Perkins went to Harvard Business School, but he learned everything. He told us he learned what he learned about business from Bill and Dave.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, even before this period, Hewlett and Packard had done a lot of innovative things in a business dimension. You know, they had created a separate company that supplied products to HP, which they then sort of bought. They bought other companies. They created central, in addition to this division model, and most of us who worked at HP worked in divisions, so it might be, desktop PCs or might have been oscilloscopes, but you were running in what felt like a fairly small to medium-sized business. But meanwhile, Bill and Dave were out acquiring companies in strategic businesses they wanted to be in. They were creating a central research lab called HP Labs, where they're acquiring talent to figure out how to get into businesses that the divisions wouldn't naturally pursue. A lot of HP's great businesses actually came out of those central efforts as well as bubbling up from the divisions. Right. So no, I think it was evident that there was a huge amount of innovation, not only in the technology, but in the approach to creating business.
So if we fast forward from 1957, about 20 years, Webb, we get to another critical point for the company around 78 that you identify in the book when John Young, who was the first non-founder CEO, I guess would be a way to describe him, he faced a major question about the firm's place in the computer industry.
Right.
Could you talk a little bit about him and tell us about this decision in 78 for Hewlett-Packard to strive for leadership in the computer industry?
Yeah, I mean, this is a pretty a pivotal moment for the company because in 1978, to back up a little bit, HP got into the computer business initially kind of by accident. And what I'll explain that is that by the mid to late 60s, when HP started off, it was vacuum tubes and analog technology, but the technology had moved on to digital technology, transistors, integrated circuits, and the instruments that HP was building suddenly were partly digital, and they were controllable by computers. And the cost of computing had come down greatly, and so now you saw emerging very sophisticated automatic measuring systems that Hewlett-Packard's competitors were beginning to introduce, that HP needed to be in. And so the first thing that HP did that led them into the computer business was to acquire some engineers from Union Carbide, take them to HP Labs, and invent the first computer, which Packard, have a great story, I think this was in Chuck House's book, that they showed Dave this computer. They were going to take it to the IEEE show in New York, and it was this big rack of equipment, and it said HP 2116 computer on it, and Packard said, you take that off and call it an instrument controller. I don't want to piss off IBM. So Dave, at that point, he knew he needed something to control his instruments, but he didn't want to, he was selling a lot of product to the computer business companies, and so he did not want to create problems there. And then the other early thing that HP did is, again, because of digital technology, scientists for a long time had used mechanical calculators to do scientific calculations. Well, now you could do that with electronics, and so HP introduced a desktop electronic scientific calculator. Both of those ventures into what became computing were really just extensions of their product line and serving their existing customers, scientists and engineers. So they didn't at that point really imagine becoming a computer company in the sense that IBM was. But later, there was another line of computers that was a business computer that was created, and then John Young became CEO. And the question, his biggest decision he had to make strategically was 43% of our revenue is computers. I think HP was over $1 billion then, maybe 1.3 billion. But not a lot of profit. The profit was still coming from the instrumentation business. So they'd been using the profits from instruments to fund a lot of this computer investment. And they really had to decide at this point, are we going to stay in computers and therefore become a leader because you only did things to be a leader and to make a contribution, or are we going to pull out? So as John described it to us on a couple of occasions, he and Dave spent weeks, if not a couple months, looking at this situation and concluded that they had to be in the computer business for real. And the reasons were multiple. One was the size of the market. You know, HP wanted to continue to grow, not just for the sake of growth, but they wanted to keep growing to provide opportunities to their employees and managers and retain their talent and to have their stock go up, and for a variety of reasons. They needed to find a bigger market. I mean, it's interesting, earlier I was saying that I think Keysight, which is the test and measurement business, is under $3 billion. So HP got a lot bigger than that, and they couldn't have done that if they just would have stayed in instrumentation. Second reason was when they looked at who was buying their computers, it was all their big instrument customers, right? So if they'd pulled out of the business, it would have disrupted the rest of their business too. So there was a barrier to exit issue as well. So, you know, Packard, as we've been told, Packard just said, well, John, I guess we have to become a leader in computers. It'll take 25 years, good luck. And shook hands with him and exited stage left. Dave was never too involved in this whole effort in the computer business, although he was still chairman of the board. He just let John run with it. Well, when Young took this on, it must have been pretty sobering, because when he looked at the magnitude of the challenge he had, it was enormous. HP, in part because of not thinking about it very strategically, had 3 overlapping lines of 16-bit mini computers at the time. They all had their own, not only their own architectures, but their own operating systems, their own networking protocols. Everything their competitors did once, HP had to do 3 times. HP was number 15 or so. People debate exactly, but they certainly weren't a leader. They were way down in the second, third tier. And as John surveyed the situation, he also realized that HP really didn't have a lot of depth in computer technologists. In fact, most of the people who were involved in HP's computer business, like John, had come from the instrument business, right? HP liked to hire from within, provide opportunities to their people, but as a result of that, maybe they were lacking some skills they needed in the computer business. So John did a variety of pretty bold things. One was that he went to HP Labs, which was kind of the crown jewels of R&D, and he told the guy who ran HP Labs, Barney Oliver, who didn't really like computers very much, Barney, we're going to create a computer lab, research lab, and I'm going to take about a 30-year budget, and that's where it's going to go. So any of you remember Barney, you can imagine how happy he was with that. And then he went out and he hired IBM's top computer researcher, a guy named Joel Birnbaum. And Joel was at IBM. He'd invented leadership computer architectures, but IBM never used them because they owned the market and they didn't want to disrupt their current products. So he was not happy at IBM. So John hired Joel and put him in this part of HP Labs. Joel brought a bunch more world-class architects in with him. They began working on something that became a real breakthrough 32-bit computer architecture called HP Precision Architecture eventually. But meanwhile, there were also 3 competing 32-bit architecture efforts in HP, and he had to figure out what to do with those. And there's actually kind of a very interesting story Joel told us, that when he left IBM, the general counsel pulled him in his office, and you know who this was. What was it?
Yeah, Nicholas Katzenbach, who was the guy who was facing down on the school's yard steps when Kennedy was trying to segregate the school in Alabama.
Yeah, so he was
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, anyhow, he was a big-time guy, and he told Joel, he said, you're going to HP, you can't tell them anything you know, right, as you do, yeah. And so Joel came to HP and he met with Bill Hewlett and he said, Bill, he says, I've got this problem. I'm excited to be here. I want to work on this, but I had this meeting with Katzenbach and Bill said, well, I'll tell you two things. He said, one is they didn't tell you couldn't ask questions. And you know the right questions to ask, right? And the second is we got some pretty smart people around here, so just because IBM couldn't do it doesn't mean we couldn't. So, but anyhow, the way this rolled out is there was one of these internal architecture efforts called Vision that was almost identical to a project IBM had tried and spent huge amounts of money and failed at. It was a flawed architecture. And it took Joel quite a while to convince John that he should drop this and just go with the architecture that Joel was creating. But ultimately, he was able to be successful. He did ask the questions. Apparently, it got to a point where the questions he asked were so pointed that John said, Joel, you give me the questions, I'll ask them. But ultimately, this new architecture, HPPA, became selected as the way to go. A whole new line of computers was developed around that. But the problem was there were still these three divisions that had their own computers, the current line. And John basically overrode the division model to a great extent and basically took away the R&D labs from these divisions in terms of new products and basically said, you tell Joel what you need and he'll give you the box, right? And so he created, John, I think, correctly had to centralize. He had to get this under control so that HP's computer line was based on one architecture, one set of networking, one operating system in order for us to compete. But that created a lot of conflict with what had become the HP way. The division model, even though it was never part of the HP way, became how the work got done, right?
Right.
And so that led to a lot of frustration. A lot of people left. There was a lot of attrition of the division managers who were no longer king. And Packard, at the end, in 1990, Packard sort of reinserted himself into the situation and forced Young to simplify the operating model. And what's interesting looking forward now is that the operating model that was put in was what became Agilent, what became Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, and what became HP Inc. So it was, those were the three operations, and Packard basically said, these are our three businesses, and don't try to do too much across them. So in a way, they became sort of the Uber divisions of the company. Anyhow, this ultimately had a great ending because when these products, when they came out, it took 8 years from the time Young became CEO till the first new systems shipped. So it was a very difficult transition time for the company. But I think when John retired, HP was maybe number 4 and growing way faster than the market. Ultimately became tied essentially for number 1 with IBM. And that was very successful. The only thing I want to add to that is that at the same time, HP got in the printer business. So while Young was essentially throwing his body on this massive transition in the computer business, there was a group up in Boise, Idaho that introduced the LaserJet. And what was interesting about this to me is so you see in Young both this top-down strategy, strength, of conviction, but also the bottom-up innovation was still alive and well. And so, and there was a move by many people that they didn't think HP should be selling printers on other people's computers. The LaserJet was designed to work with the IBM PC, not our own PCs necessarily. And Young basically told the other people, you don't sell enough computers for the LaserJet guys to care. That's the problem you need to solve. And so under Young, not only was the computer business transformed, but the printer business was created as well.
Well, before we fast forward another 20 years to another pivot point, 1998, I want to ask you, Philip, it seems like that in that decision of Young and Packard to go for leadership in the computer industry, do you have a quick thought about what gave them confidence that that was possible? I could see if you were looking at things and saying, yes, it would make sense to be the top company in the computer industry. What made them think that they could do that?
Well, this is kind of a squishy cultural answer. There's no data behind this, but it's confidence. And Webb pointed to that. They felt that they could do what IBM couldn't do. IBM, a much bigger company, even older than HP, and the only other company to survive as many transformations as HP was IBM. And they felt that they could succeed where IBM failed. And then it's confidence. It's not hubris.
Yeah.
That's part of the HP way, is to be quietly confident about your skills and your abilities.
Yeah, I think I would answer that. I would agree with that. I think there are kind of two aspects to it. One is, I used to say, what was the John Lennon line? There's nothing you can do that can't be done, kind of thing. So I think we believed that we could do anything, but it wasn't. But we knew it might take time, right?
Oh.
So it was a combination. It's like when Packard said to Young, "This will take 25 years." He wasn't kidding, but that also tells you that he was willing to stay focused for as long as it took to get the job done. And so I remember a general managers meeting where one of the executives got up and said, "Wow, we woke up one day and there was IBM outside." We knew how difficult this was going to be. So it wasn't done out of hubris. It was done, but we believed we could do it. It was just part of the culture.
Well, let's take that jump 20 years then from that time, after that decision to strive for leadership in computing, 1998, and the company was facing some real challenges around growth. Louis Platt, the CEO who had succeeded Young, developed some bold proposals around contending with those growth challenges. And Philip, could you fill us in about what happened?
Sure. Well, so John Young's decision to go into computers and the way he executed and the fact that he was able to succeed teed HP up very well. So by the late 80s, early 90s, HP is struggling a little bit because they're putting so many investments into getting the computer system out the door. They get it out the door, it's a big success. And HP starts minting money, both between the computer systems, which was a success, and the printers, imaging and printing, which was a huge success. You see them on the cover of magazines, the Rich Boy Scouts, right? That's what the cover story was, Rich Boy Scouts. HP way, they're all nice, but they're minting money over at HP. So they're growing and they're growing and they're growing. Lou Platt is the CEO for this, and he has a different version of management. He doesn't see that the CEO's role is to really be in charge of strategy. It's to oversee the group presidents who he puts in charge of strategy. How well that works is debatable, but it doesn't show up for a while because all the momentum that they have between the computer systems and the printers. Well, HP it grows so quickly that they start reaching a point where, and Webb alluded to this earlier, let me just back up a second. Probably a lot of people in the room here have read Dave Packard's book, The HP Way, or at least have heard of it. That book comes out, a terrific book. It comes out in 1995, which turns out to be pretty much the high water mark for HP in terms of the success. So by 1995, they hit $30 billion in revenue. In 1997, they hit $40 billion in revenue. And Lou Platt starts looking at, he's thinking, how can I continue to grow this, right? Because they wanted profitable growth. They're not just growing for growing's sake, they want profitable growth. And Lou Platt's reading this research that was promulgated at the time, which turns out to be pretty accurate, saying that a lot of companies hit what they were calling stall points at around $40 billion. That's about $60 billion today. And Lou Platt's worried about this. He's worried that HP could stall, because how do you follow up on the success that he's had in his first 5 years? Stock split in 2-for-1 in 1995, split 2-for-1 again in 1996. I mean, can you imagine if you've been holding stock then? Some of you probably were. And those are your Ferraris and your Teslas out that I saw parked outside. And so Platt's worried about how do you follow up on this growth? And sure enough, 1998, growth turns negative. And Platt's saying, Platt sees the organization as just as Webb described it, with the different businesses, and he's thinking, we can't continue to grow this way that we've been growing. Now this is a big deal, and if you see in the book, you'll see how Platt thought about his role as the CEO. This was pretty to have this kind of approach is pretty antithetical to the way he saw his job as a CEO, but he saw no way around this. So he undertakes some research, which was codenamed Project Giraffe there, he and some consultants, and he proposes to the board that they split HP. They split HP into 4 companies. That was the outcome of Project Giraffe. Now we get into the board. And HP's board at that time, very distinguished, Nobel laureates, very distinguished people, but it was a founders board, meaning they did what Bill and Dave told them to do. And by this time, this is Bill and Dave are in their 80s this time. They made sure their children are on the board too. So it's a founders board and a family board. And I should say, as you might expect from the children of Bill and Dave, also very accomplished, but not really in the business. So you have a board who's somewhat disengaged from the business, the founders' friends, and a board members who are really primarily concerned with their father's legacy, the family members, have to deal with this decision, which was very dramatic. Should we split up HP? And the board decides, it's really the family decides, well, we'll allow you to split off test and measurement because that is really the core, that's what we think is the legacy business from our fathers. Platt, who thought he might be left to run one of the businesses, no, thank you, Platt, you should retire. And we're going to look around for a CEO. And they look around for a CEO, and there are some brilliant candidates there, but they feel that the company had been so siloed that there was nobody who ran across the company, right? So there was nobody. They thought it would be better. The board thought it would be better, circa 1999, to look outside Hewlett-Packard for leadership. And that brings us.
Anything to add on this?
Yeah, just a couple of other observations, I think, from this time frame. One is, it's kind of a conundrum, is that when Lou first became CEO, there was work now to build a 64-bit processor to follow on the 32-bit processor that had been so successful. But by then, the PC business was growing like crazy. Intel was building more microprocessors than we could ever imagine building. Fabs were not getting cheaper. I don't think they've gotten cheaper yet, no. And so so Platt and his team made, I think, a correct decision from 100,000 feet, which is HP really can't compete in the processor business anymore. So we're going to rely over time. We still had our own 32-bit processors, so this was going to play out over some time. But we are not going to develop another processor. That led to a joint project with Intel on something called Itanium, the 64-bit processor, which didn't really work out quite as people had imagined because the 32-bit processors are what really won, the Intel processors with blades and all this. So, but nonetheless, as this began to play out as forecasted, HP had one group that was based on our proprietary architecture and one group that was based on Intel architecture. And they had trouble resolving how this was going to transition. So the sales forces were fighting. There are many attempts to try to figure out how to be in both of these businesses. One of the leaders thought that they could win over Microsoft's operating systems in Intel, and the other thought Intel was going to eat the world. And so you ended up, I think, with the absence of a strong strategic decision at the top, and this happens, by the way, I think almost always. If an organization doesn't have a strong strategic direction, it fights with itself a lot. So you ended up with a lot of contention, and eventually, of course, it all played out to where the Intel processors, did win. But that took a long time, and HP lost a lot of time on that.
To echo what Webb just said about fighting with yourself, to situate this in a piquant bit of irony. So 1998, 1999, down the street, Apple Computer. People say they were weeks away from bankruptcy at this time. Fast forward, so 1998, 1999. Fast forward to 2011, Apple is the world's most valuable company, and they're landing their spaceship in Cupertino on what had been HP's campus there.
Oh, now you're being mean. I used to work there.
That's right.
Okay, so there was kind of this conundrum between making essentially the right strategic decision, but not knowing how to operationalize it as it unfolded. Largely because the business units were fighting, and back to the division as king kind of thing. That's where the profit was, and so if no one was willing to basically just make a call, they fought. The second one, which is also I think very interesting, is that after Joel Birnbaum, who created the RISC architecture for HP, and got all these computers to market. After it was all over, he was exhausted. And I mean, after all, he was a researcher. He ended up developing all this stuff, and so I think it was either John or Lou. I think it was John at the end of his time said, Joel, why don't you go over in this building here and think, just cool your jets and think about the future of the business. And Joel came back, and this was now when Lou was CEO, and he said, okay, here's the future. Information technology will be delivered as a service. The internet will be everywhere, and everything will be connected. So basically, he predicted the cloud, the Internet of Things, software as a service, all this stuff. But again, HP's management couldn't agree on how to move forward with that. And in fact, Joel had a very specific proposal that was called MC squared. See, it sounds like a good techie thing. Measurement, communications, and computing. No one else had all that. This was the first, I think, of many strategies. We're the only ones doing all those strategies. And, but the individual business units wouldn't get behind it. And that then ultimately led Lou to go the other way to say, we can't figure out how to leverage all this stuff. We should split it up. So that's another interesting perspective, I think, from the Platt era.
Well, let's go back to something that Philip was describing, the move to bring in so-called outside CEOs. That is to say,
right.
CEOs from the firm that hadn't, in some sense, come up through the ranks at Hewlett-Packard. And so starting in 1999 through 2010, we have Carly Fiorina and Mark Hurd, and we really see growth in the firm. Primarily, it seems, through acquisitions. Webb, could you describe that period for us?
Looking back on it, this is kind of the speed dating era, I guess, in a way. But you're right. I think what characterizes this era is a strategy. So it's kind of interesting. So Platt goes into the board and says, too big, too complicated, the businesses are too different, we need to break it up so we can focus. And the board says, no, we're going to go outside. And then the strategy becomes be as big as possible. So it's kind of like a strategic whiplash, And so the strategy that Fiorina landed on after there was an attempt to buy PwC's consulting business, that fell through. That led to the Compaq acquisition. But the basic strategy was economies of scale. The market's consolidating. We need to be the biggest in order to have the best cost structure and so on. And that, I would say, was the strategy was relatively continuous between Fiorina and Hurd on that. The difference was that Fiorina had problems hitting the financial projection she was giving Wall Street, right? So after first of all, the Compaq merger itself was very contentious. And I think when you look at how the Walter Hewlett and David Woodley Packard responded and why they were so upset, I think because a lot of it, if you think about those Packard philosophies and Hewlett philosophies about don't grow for growth's sake, it's all about technical contribution, profitable growth, it was hard to follow the thread. Right. This was a very different strategy, and I think Walter was quoted saying, "My father never would have done this." He never explained what that meant, but I think it was probably those kinds of things, exposing HP to much more of its business becoming PC technology, where it's harder to make a contribution. Kind of a nasty. You probably remember if you were breathing. You remember it was a kind of a nasty fight. The stock went from, I think HP stock peaked in 99, around the time Lou was sort of the end of the Platt era at 65 or something. And I think, as I recall, after this merger was announced, the stock went it was in the teens. I don't remember the exact number, but it was painful. But the problem then became that the board was very supportive of the strategy, but then the company was not hitting its quarters. You remember how many, 8 quarters or something were missed?
Yeah.
There's something. So over the next few years, many times HP missed its numbers. The stock just didn't move. And so in 2004, the board, which had changed, by the way, the board changed after the Compaq merger. It was a different board. There were some common players, but it was a different board. That's when Tom Perkins actually rejoined the company as a board member because he'd been on the Compaq board. So the board started putting pressure on Fiorina to get a COO in place to help with these operational issues. And she said, essentially over my dead body, and they said, "We accept your offer." I think. I'm paraphrasing. So then the next CEO, Mark Hurd, really, I think, certainly didn't really make big strategy changes. I think he, again, was a believer in the basic strategy that Fiorina had put in place. But he was really operational. He was like the complete, oftentimes when you hire leaders, you kind of go back, ping pong back and forth between, oh boy, the last one wasn't very operational, we're going to fix that, right?
Okay, yeah.
And so Hurd was extremely operational. He simplified the organization of the company, he improved the results, he also cut costs quite a bit, and so he began an ongoing set of cost cutting. The company was growing as a result of industry standard servers and notebook PCs. And the stock really took off. They really rewarded the fact that here's the company's now hitting its numbers again. But then he began to struggle with growth partway through his time. And so at that point in time, he became very acquisitive. And he bought EDS, which brought hundreds of thousands of people to HP, a big services business. He bought 3Com to bolster the networking business. He bought Palm in an attempt to try to get HP into the smartphone and tablet area. And then he kind of got tripped up in a personal scandal, which obviously was public, and was fired by the board. The interesting thing is the board was so polarized over the firing of Hurd that they really weren't speaking to one another. So I mean, there were multiple factions who literally did not speak, and it was in that environment that they hired Leo Apotheker, who had been a CEO at SAP for about 7 months, I think. And they brought him in. I think they hired him before they hired the chairman. But anyhow, it was a real messy situation when Leo came in. So Leo, this is a book about strategy and strategic leadership. So Leo, from a strategic point of view, looked at this and he said, boy, this company's been heading the wrong way. This bigger is better and all these commoditized products were not differentiated enough. And his idea was to get HP into enterprise software, which, not surprisingly, was where he had come from at SAP. And but he wasn't against acquiring, so he bought Autonomy for $11.7 billion, which was a small British software company that you guys may have heard of, and that didn't go too well. And then what really kind of tripped Apotheker up is on an earnings call, he sort of casually mentioned he was thinking about spinning out the PC business. And that's the guy who was running the PC business had heard of it. And this was kind of a Trumpian moment in a way. So all the employees are completely freaked out. The customers go, what? There was no plan to do this. It was an idea, but no plan. And that ultimately led to Apotheker's ouster. And Meg Whitman, who had been on the board for about 6 months, I think, or something, she became the 8th CEO for HP in 2011. Over that whole period, HP spent $60+ billion acquiring things. So you kind of look at this whole, what I call the speed dating period, but I mean, seriously, it was a growth by acquisition strategy, but a huge amount of money was spent. And it got HP in 2011 to $127 billion, but then after that was unable to grow, and that's, I think, where our next section, but yeah.
Well, before we turn to the challenges that Meg Whitman has been facing and her strategic leadership, just listening to you both, it seems like if we talk about that moment when Young and Packard decide, okay, it's going to take 25 years, but we can become, the top of the computer industry. Well, 25 years, give or take, in this period, maybe with the Compaq acquisition, they have achieved that. The irony is that the company is no longer the company that they began with. So they've profoundly changed the company in doing that. Does
And,
that
and the computer
resonate?
and the computer business
Right.
wasn't the same business.
That's true.
Margins
it
have
was.
shifted completely.
Yeah, yeah,
That's true.
yeah.
Well, maybe let's talk about the current CEO's tenure and her major strategic moves.
Well, so, Meg Whitman inherits a mess. So, so as Webb mentioned, Mark Hurd left prematurely. The board had gone from a founders and families board to just completely dysfunctional. And you probably in the audience remember the pretexting scandals and things like that. I mean, just their dysfunction had just spilled out into the public, and in a very public way. And so that's the context that Meg Whitman enters HP on. So she's brought onto the board, and 6 months later, the CEO role is thrust on her. Now, Meg did okay in a little startup down the street, so she didn't need this job, but she took it on, and she took it on with she does a kind of the first couple of months there as CEO, she keeps her mouth closed, keeps her head down, just goes around the business looking and assessing it for herself. And a couple months later, she says, okay, we're better together. HP is better together. So we're not going to split up. We're going to be better together. We're going to fix this thing. And she starts making some cultural changes at HP that are pretty meaningful. Now, when Webb mentioned these $60+ billion of acquisitions, that really has a bad effect on your culture. When HP acquired Compaq, the cultures were very different. One executive, HP executive, who was there before at HP before and there after the Compaq acquisition, said, acquiring Compaq was like the Hells Angels, Compaq, marrying the Stepford Wives, HP. And the subsequent acquisitions weren't any better. Yeah. And so the culture was warped. And this isn't like making small gene editing changes with a CRISPR. This is like just mixing these cultures and hoping something better comes off, and it doesn't. So she had a mess. The culture was a mess when she becomes CEO. She starts adjusting the culture and making some strides in that area, but she just cannot get growth. HP is not growing at this time. They have negative compound annual growth rates of, depending on how you want to measure it, between more than 3% or 5%. She can't get them to grow. And so she comes to the conclusion that Platt came to back in 1999, split up. And that's where we have HPE Enterprise and HP Incorporated.
Any thoughts?
Well, I think, first of all, we had actually hoped to finish this book earlier, but we're kind of glad we didn't, because because when you look at this thread of Packard in 1990 saying it's test and measurement, it's computer systems and computer products, and then you realize 25 years later those are the three companies. When you look at Platt's conclusion and then going completely the opposite direction, and then coming to the same conclusion again. That's interesting. I think one could argue that if HP had acted on this sooner, that maybe they'd be in better shape than having waited so long. But I think it points to how difficult some of these decisions are. Where is their leverage, and where does the complexity? Leverage tends to always look good on paper, but when you try to operationalize that leverage, it creates a lot of complexity and it makes a company slow. And I think what Whitman ultimately concluded is that it sounded good, but it wasn't realizable, that they weren't necessarily getting the best deals that they thought they were going to get, and that they couldn't move faster. When the market's moving fast, look what's happening, how disruptive the cloud is. When the market's moving fast, you don't want to be slow. You don't want to be the slowest game in town, right? Mm-hmm. So I think ultimately and that's not terribly different, I mean, for different external reasons, not terribly different than the conclusion Platt came to. Another thing is the stocks of both companies have done pretty well. So unlike when the Compaq merger was announced and the stock went from wherever it was to 13 or something, both of these stocks, HP Enterprise in particular, I think has done pretty well. I don't have the data top of mind, but I think it's up around 50% since it split out. HP Inc. has done pretty well too. So the market seems to like it, seems to be buying it. So I think, the jury's still out, but I think it looks like it was the right thing to do. And I think it's also interesting to look at how Hewlett-Packard Enterprise has continued to simplify and spin out and focus. So I think they're clearly headed down that path. And One observation looking back on the whole thing is that in some ways HP was a victim of its own success. So Hewlett-Packard created a very innovative company that created a lot of businesses and then ultimately had great difficulty managing all that complexity. HP seemed to always be in more businesses than anyone they were competing against. You know, when you think of it, Apple and Lexmark and IBM, and you pick it, it was like, who am I competing with in this part of my day if you were the CEO of HP? So I think there are a lot of important lessons about how to look at when are you too big and when are you better splitting up and being more focused through this.
Well, thank you. Now that we've kind of brought the story up to the present, maybe we could turn to entertain some questions from our audience. But I'll take the prerogative from sitting up here to cut into the front of the line and ask 2 quick questions. And you've organized this book around CEOs,
Right.
Even to the chapter level. So a natural question I think that came up for me and will come up for other readers is, what makes that different from a great man or great woman history? Or another way of asking the question is, do CEOs really matter that much? And if they do, how is it that they matter so much? So to whomever.
I'll lead off. So you're right. You know, it was Thomas Carlyle who said, the history of the world is the biography of great men, and at HP, great women. We don't go that far, but we chose the organization the framework that we did by CEOs because when we examined HP, when we examined the leadership, the strategic leadership at HP, we used the context that Robert Burgelman developed at Stanford, which is the strategic leadership capability. And that is the leader's ability to do a couple of things. Bottom line is the ability to walk and chew gum at the same time. But strategic leadership capability is really the ability to manage top-down strategy and benefit from bottom-up strategy formulation. It's the ability to manage strategy and culture. It's the ability to balance today's opportunities with investing for the future. And it's the ability to maintain an effective board relationship. And CEOs do some aspects of those things better than others. And we also situate each chapter and each leadership era within the context. So only Bill and Dave started de novo. Only they started with a clean slate. So Bill and Dave left something for John Young. John Young inherited a deck of cards when he was given a hand of cards when he was there. He had to play. John Young left a situation for Lou Platt that he had to play.
Right.
Similarly, Lou left for Fiorina. Fiorina left for Hurd Apotheker, and to Whitman. Each of those CEOs inherited a context in which they had to operate. And so we try in the book to show both how each leader did within the framework of the strategic leadership capability and how they handled the context that they inherited, how they changed the context during their tenure, and the context that they left for the person who followed. And so that seemed like a good way for the readers to track the narrative arc of HP over 70 plus years.
No, I think that's right. And I think this insight into the fact, I think we all as humans want to kind of maybe give the one person too much credit or too little credit. It's like sports coaches. But what we're trying to do is show the context they're operating in. So, you don't have all available choices when you're inheriting a situation. You have to decide what's the most important thing for that organization's success. So hopefully that's a fairly unique contribution we're making in the book, is to be able to help understand not only what the CEOs did, but what the hand, as Philip said, the hand they were dealt.
And I suppose the biggest contextual factor that they're facing is the people that they're working with and the organization thereof.
A coin. So the one side of the coin is the culture, the squishy stuff, and the other side is much of the stuff that Webb was talking about, the structural context of the industry that you face. So HP becomes a leader in the computer industry, but the computer industry is completely transformed from when they got into it, and all the margins go to Wintel.
Right.
By the time you get there. By the time you're a leader, the pot of gold at the end is a lot smaller than you thought it was going to be.
And that, by the way, an interesting, back to the Platt, the Young transition, one of the things, I was working in the early days of the PC business at HP when John Young was the CEO, And when we interviewed John, I said, you know, John, you never seemed very enthusiastic about this business. He said, I wasn't. He said, I didn't like it. We didn't have any control over the business. It was all Intel and Microsoft. I was really worried what would happen if we became successful. I thought that was a fascinating comment. And then you flip ahead to the Platt era, and basically the decision was, well, if we're going to be leaders in computers, and computers are going to be based on Intel, then we need to learn how to do that well. We need to lead at that.
Right.
And to HP's credit, they did lead at that. I mean, they are leaders. So it's back to, if you stick to it, HP took a long time for HP to find success in the PC business, but they became number one. Now they're kind of going back and forth with Lenovo, but
Right.
that's not easy to do. There are a lot of companies who tried to do that and didn't.
My other question is about, is kind of to say, couldn't you argue that Agilent and Keysight are actually the descendants of the company that Bill and Dave started, and that maybe HP Inc. and Hewlett Packard Enterprise are more properly seen as the descendants of Compaq?
Well, you mind if I?
You're the HP way guy.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me say that, you know, the HP way, I mean, it's a wonderful thing, but it's a lot of different things. And even in the early days of HP, I think every division, even when HP was an instrument company, each division thought, we're where the real HP way is. Right. Those guys at Microwave, that's not the HP way.
Right.
We're at Santa Clara, we're the HP way. Yeah. So there were differences, you know, and it was a set of principles, you know. And the other thing is, as HP became a multi-business company, really, moving beyond instruments to computer systems and PCs and printers, each business sort of has its own culture, too. And it was true even in instruments. There was a semiconductor, you know, the LED lighting. And part of that is because we had a head of HR, Susan Boeck, when I was there, who made a great statement, and that is that a lot of what people mean when they talk about culture is, how does the work get done around here? So it's not, part of culture is values, it's integrity, it's customers first, but how are the decisions made? How do we run this place? And that is, to some extent, different from business to business. So the culture in the PC part of the company wasn't the same as in the computer systems. And in fact, when people would try to reorganize and mush those two cultures together, it didn't work very well. Very different business models, very different ways of operating. So part of a culture is it's a mix of some things that are universal, like the values, and some differences in how the work is done. Now, having said that, I think that it's probably a fair statement that Agilent and Keysight, those are the original businesses of HP, and they're probably the most pure instantiations of the HP culture today. Don't know how they're operating. I'm sure they've changed. HP Inc. Is mostly HP. You know, there are a lot more people in the printing business than in the PC business by the nature of the model. If you look at the leaders, the CFO, the COO, the head of printing, the head of 3D printing are all longtime HP people. So when I talk to people who are interacting with that company today, they say, boy, it sure feels a lot like HP. Now, obviously, there's a Compaq component to the PC business, but you know, we used maybe half of the PC business was HP people and half was Compaq. So I think HP Inc. probably has some variant of the HP culture. HP Enterprise is the product of so many mergers, you know, and now they're spinning some of them back out. But if you think of it, I mean, HP Enterprise, before the Compaq merger, I think HP had, what, like 75,000 people or something like that. And let's say, you know, half of them or more, 40,000 were, you know, so were HP. Well, EDS alone had hundreds of thousands of people. So Compaq had, you know, as many people as we did. So you kind of look at how many of the people who are working for HP Enterprise ever worked for HP before the acquisition started. It's probably not very high. Now, interestingly, with these spin-offs of services and software, it's probably a little higher. But I suspect HP Enterprise has its own culture. I don't know what it is, and it's a little bit of a mashup, as Philip said. It's hard. It's very hard to change cultures. It's very hard to norm cultures. And HPE, Hewlett Packard Enterprise, is a product of many different cultures. So I really don't know what it's like.
Any thoughts on this one, Philip?
No, I think that's
Okay.
well.
Well, a great question from our audience. What led you to write this book? So what's the history of this book?
You should start this.
I'll start
'cause
that.
You were in before I was.
All right, so we'll give you the quick, long answer. So I joined Robert Burgelman and Andy Grove at Stanford in 1999. And in a class, Robert and Andy started a class probably 18 years before I joined them 15 years before I joined them in 1999. So a long-running enterprise. It was a very special class that the two did at Stanford, and I joined them in 99. And we did our own it was a strategy class at the business school, and we do our own case studies. So we write our own case studies. And Fiorina was just coming into HP, and Andy says, you know, it'd be interesting to have a case on HP. He calls up Carly Fiorina, her first week on the job probably, being Andy, you know. And he says, you know, I do this class, we'd like to write a case study. And so Robert and I go and write this case study with Fiorina, and she's been there for 6 months. And that's where we met Webb. And Robert and I did a couple of case studies, always involving Webb. And then Webb decides to go legit and leaves HP. And then we were doing some research together, and the three of us were standing around and thinking, you know, HP has some troubles, but it's amazing just how they've been able to survive these transitions. And we had the idea of doing a book, and you want to take it from there?
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. I mean, we had worked together we published a paper about the HP Compaq merger. We had done a business case together on HP and the networking business. Some of that has found its way into our book. And then my version of it is I got an email from Robert saying, Philip and I want to write a book. Do you want to help us? And my initial reaction, honestly, was, does the world really need another book about Hewlett-Packard? You know, because there have been a few. And but then when I understood the focus, which was the strategic leadership, I said, now that hasn't been done, and that's a great compliment to what has been done. And so I signed on, and like I said, 80 interviews, and 6 years later, here we are.
It's kind of like a setup to a bad joke. It's a business school professor, a senior executive, a consultant walk into a bar.
Yeah.
A book comes out.
I know, let's write a book. Yeah.
Well, another great question from the audience. Obviously, the university context, Stanford, Terman, was very important for the very beginning of the story. The question from the audience is that over the years, universities played an important role in the growth and development of new HP operations. They're asking if you could quantify this university impact on HP, past and present, or maybe if you can't quantify it, could you comment on it?
Well, I mean, I do think that we had a lot of research going on that was, well, obviously we benefited from hiring a lot of people from universities. First of all, let me say that. I was involved actually in a business. When I first started, I was in the instrumentation side, and we were building products that were designed to measure structural dynamics of things. And we created a liaison with the University of Cincinnati, a professor there, and he basically became like a part of our team, advising us and making sure we understood the technology and the measurements that were needed. So, I mean, I think that was fairly typical, that when you were developing products or you were researching, you were looking to see what schools had the skill sets that you could benefit from. But no, I don't really have any specific knowledge beyond that.
Philip, any thoughts?
Well, sure. You know, so Bill and Dave, from this HP standpoint, remained very close. Terman was on their board through the 70s. So he was on their first board. Fred Terman, the engineering professor at Stanford, the one who midwifed the company and made it possible for them to even be in HP, remained on the board, remained active. They funded research at Stanford. They brought people there. One of the early employees, I mentioned him earlier, Court, who died about a year and a half ago, so asked Bill Hewlett for a job, was declined because they weren't hiring. This is just in World War II had just started, and Court was finishing his degree before he went off to the Navy. And Court, but he needed the money. Court had this device that was hard to find, so Bill bought that from him for a few $100s, that tided him over. Court finishes his master's degree, finishes his service in the Navy, comes back and has a 35-year career at HP. that kind of, so.
Well, you reminded me of the Bagley story, too. So
Oh, you gotta tell that.
there's a guy named Al Bagley he and John Young were the first two division managers, and Al's now in his early 90s. And he went to MIT, he went to Caltech undergrad, went to Stanford, and he got a scholarship from Hewlett and Packard. This was in the 40s, right? So he became HP's 8th engineer after he got his master's. But he got this scholarship from Bill and Dave, and Bill and Dave went over to Stanford and met with him and said, well, what are you going to study for your master's? What's your project? And Al said, well, I haven't thought about it. And they said, well, here's what we'd like you to do. We've got an idea for this high-speed frequency counter, this technology. We think it'll work. Why don't you work on that? And if it works out, then maybe we can develop it at HP. So that's what happened. So they essentially directed his thesis, and then hired him and created the business. Yeah. So I'm sure there are lots and lots of examples.
Right.
I just wasn't too close to them
Kind
personally.
of like in your book about Gordon Moore, you talk about Gordon's relationship with Caltech and how that
Right.
went back and forth.
For recruiting, and also I suppose in the early couple decades of the company, their customers were mostly
Right.
engineers, scientists, researchers. So
Yeah.
There's a real symbiosis in the Bay Area in particular with Cal and Stanford and the other great schools that we have here, that when people try to replicate Silicon Valley, God knows where, they're not able to do it. This is organic, and it takes years and decades to develop these kinds of hard relationships and soft relationships.
Well, I will, our next question from the audience I've chosen because I'm not quite sure what it means, and I'll hope you can decode it for me, which is how close to the garage rules has HP remained, and is doing so important? I don't know what the garage rules are. This is a term of lore.
Is this the rules of the garage, or is this?
This is what Fiorina started.
Well,
you were there for.
I'm not sure. Yeah, who asked that question? Because somebody could explain it. The rules of the garage? You mean when Fiorina came? Yeah. Well, yeah, and this gets back to, this 1957 period that Philip was talking about, when HP divisionalized and went public and did a variety of things. That was the first time they really codified the HP way. It actually wasn't called the HP way, interestingly enough. I've got the brochure. It's called Corporate Objectives. Yeah. Hewlett had a great line about corporate. He said, we use management by objectives here. Don't ever confuse that with democracy. So I think, and those principles, those objectives, which included, integrity and profit, it was a collection of things, maybe, 8 or something different categories of things that became kind of our guideposts for how we ran the company. That would be, if you recall, that would be revised from time to time, so maybe every 5 years they would change the emphasis of something a little bit. When Carly Fiorina came in, one of the first things she did, which actually was kind of confusing to people, is we came to work one day and there were posters everywhere called the rules of the garage. And there was a picture of a garage there with all these rules on there. So that's why I was asking what exactly meant there. And they were sort of similar, but nobody knew why they were there or how they were different or why, what does that mean the other ones we don't pay attention to anymore? But more generally, I think it's an excellent question, and I think that as I said, there are 4 companies now that were HP once. You probably get a different answer in each one of those. I think it's different between HP Enterprise and HP Inc. I went to the launch of HP Inc. In November of 2015. And went to the employee presentation, which was nice to be able to do that. And there was a huge focus on restoring the HP way, the traditional HP way. Now, I don't know where they are in that journey, but I think there's an attempt. I know when Agilent spun out, they said we want to keep the HP way, but we've got to focus more on speed. We've got to focus more on agility. So they picked out a couple of areas. I think that would have happened had HP just continued on. As I said, those corporate objectives and the HP way would be revised periodically as needed. So I suspect that at least 3 of the 4 HPs have fairly similar cultures still.
Our next question from the audience, can you please share any story of why the company is called Hewlett-Packard and not Packard-Hewlett, besides alphabetical order?
It was a coin flip.
Coin flip.
Yeah.
Is there a...
Apparently, apparently Bill and Dave flipped a coin.
It sounds better somehow.
And Hewlett won.
doesn't it? Yeah.
Okay.
You want to say that they probably had no idea how monumental it was going to be, but I suspect they did.
That decision?
when they did, well, not the decision of whose name goes first, but that we're going to actually build something. We're going to start something here that isn't going away soon.
You think they had that impression
so.
right from the
I
start?
think so, yeah.
The next question is about Dave and Bill's thinking about the importance of gaining market share. Was that a defining kind of interest?
Tell them that anecdote. Tell them the anecdote about Dave. You talk about the growth.
Well, I mean, yeah, I don't, again, gaining market share was something that happened when you created a great product or service. You didn't buy market share. So market share was important, but only if it happened as a result of having the best product, right? And also, of course, if you have very low market share, it's hard to make money. So it's not that market share isn't important, but it's just not. That's not where you start. You start with a great product or service. Out of that, you get market share, you get profit. That was the philosophy.
Well, I think our time is coming to a close, so maybe there's only time for one other question, and this might actually be a question for the audience that might be revealing about something about, the Hewlett-Packard story and culture. By show of hands, could we see how many people here are current or former HP employees?
Oh, wow.
And for those of you not able to see, that's a lot of hands.
Yeah.
Well, won't you all, who raised your hands or didn't, join me in thanking Webb and
Thank you.
Philip?
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.